Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to this explainer on the American Civil War. We're talking about a conflict that literally forged the modern United States. We are looking at four incredibly complex, devastating, and completely transformative years of history. You know, this wasn't just a series of battles. It was the ultimate test of whether a republic built on the ideals of liberty, yet sustained by the institution of slavery, could actually endure. The scope is massive, the stakes were literally the survival of a nation, and the echoes of this conflict, well, they're still heard today.
Here's a quick roadmap for today. We're going to start with the root of disunion, look at the reality of an industrial war, explore emancipation and turning points, the surrender and collapse, and then wrap up with its lasting legacy.
So, Chapter 1, The Root of Disunion, a Nation Divided. Now, to understand this crucible, we have to start at the very root of a fragile country. The historical consensus on why the nation fractured is actually really clear. After Abraham Lincoln, who actively opposed expanding slavery into new Western territories, won the 1860 election, Southern states started breaking away. And we don't really have to guess their motivations. We can just read their own secession documents. The Mississippi Secession Declaration, for example, plainly states, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." And that brings us to our core terminology, secession. Basically, it's the formal act of withdrawing from a political entity. In total, 11 Southern slave states seceded to form their own unrecognized government, the Confederate States of America. As these states broke off, they started seizing federal forts and assets within their borders. The tension finally snapped on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces bombarded the Union-held Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Just like that, the war had officially begun.
Moving right along to Chapter 2, an industrial war, looking at scale and technology. If you compare the basic economies of the North and the South right as the conflict breaks out, the contrast is absolutely stark. The North, the Union, boasted a heavily industrialized economy. We're talking established manufacturing, massive networks of railroads, and a population of over 22 million. The South, the Confederacy, was fundamentally an agrarian economy. It was built heavily around exporting cotton and utterly reliant on the forced labor of nearly 4 million enslaved people, with a total free population of only about 5.6 million. And this brilliantly illustrates that vast disparity in mobilization resources. When it came to manufacturing capacity, the factories you actually need to produce uniforms, boots, and weapons, the Union controlled a staggering 90% of the nation's output. The Confederacy held just 10%. In a long, grinding war of attrition, that massive imbalance is basically a game changer. Because of this industrial boom, this conflict witnessed a terrifyingly rapid advancement in military tech. This was truly a war of firsts. We saw the first clashes of steam-powered ironclad warships that made wooden navies obsolete literally overnight. You had generals using thousands of miles of new telegraph networks to command armies in near real time. Railroads were moving massive armies across the continent, and on the battlefield, the introduction of rapid-fire Gatling guns and repeating rifles made combat brutally efficient. It was deadly on a scale no one had ever seen.
To press that advantage, the Union implemented the Anaconda Plan. It's exactly what it sounds like, a massive naval blockade designed to slowly suffocate the Southern economy. By parking warships outside Southern seaports, the Union aimed to cut off their ability to export king cotton to Europe. Without those exports, the South couldn't buy the weapons and supplies it desperately needed, forcing them to rely on these incredibly risky, fast little ships known as blockade runners to smuggle arms in from places like the Bahamas. All right, Chapter 3, Emancipation and Turning Points and How the Goal Shifted. Now, you might be wondering halfway through all this, with such massive disadvantages in manufacturing and population, could the Confederacy actually have won? Interestingly, a lot of historians argue yes. See, the Confederacy didn't need to conquer the North or capture Washington, D.C. To win independence, they simply had to fight a defensive war long enough to exhaust the Northern public's political will to keep fighting. But the Union's willpower got a massive boost from a total shift in purpose. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared all slaves in rebel states to be legally free. This was a masterstroke that transformed the entire conflict. It was no longer just a war to preserve a political union, it was now a revolutionary war for human freedom. Crucially, it enabled roughly 190,000 African Americans to enlist in the Union Armed Forces, and it made it politically impossible for anti-slavery nations like Britain or France to formally step in and ally with the Confederacy. So the crucial point is how this moral shift was perfectly paired with massive tactical victories on the battlefield. 3 major turning points completely wrecked Confederate momentum. At Antietam in 1862, which is still the bloodiest single day in American military history, the Union halted Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North. In 1863, Gettysburg permanently ended Lee's hopes of a northern invasion. And almost simultaneously out west, the Union siege of Vicksburg successfully secured control of the Mississippi River. That effectively sliced the Confederacy right in two. By 1864, the Union strategy escalated into what we call total war. Under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant and General William Tecumseh Sherman, the Union stopped just targeting enemy armies and actually began targeting the South's fundamental capacity to wage war. Sherman's famous march to the sea through Georgia, they deliberately destroyed railroads, burned crops, and dismantled infrastructure. It was a brutal reality, absolutely, but it was specifically designed to break the economic back of the rebellion. Which brings us to Chapter 4, Surrender and Collapse, and the true cost of war. The toll on human life was absolutely staggering. Over 828,000 casualties for the Union alone. That's counting dead, wounded, and captured. It's vital to note here that in this era of medicine, disease was the real enemy. Roughly 2/3 of all fatalities during this war were actually caused by illnesses like dysentery and typhoid, not enemy bullets. Let that sink in for a second. And on the Confederate side, the numbers are equally devastating. Over 864,000 casualties. To really ground the epic scale of this suffering, consider this one tragic fact from the historical record. An estimated 56,000 soldiers from both sides combined died in horrific, overcrowded prisoner of war camps alone. Let's move to and see how this builds into the frantic spring of 1865. It's a chaotic, rapid-fire sequence of events. On April 9th, General Lee surrenders his trapped army to Grant at Appomattox. Literally 5 days later, tragedy strikes the victorious North when President Lincoln is assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer. But the military collapse just keeps rolling. On April 26th, General Johnston surrenders the largest remaining Confederate force. And finally, on June 19th, which we now celebrate as Juneteenth, Union troops arrive in Texas to enforce the emancipation of the very last enslaved people in the Confederacy. Finally, Chapter 5, The Lasting Legacy of a Rebuilt Nation. The most concrete legacies of the war are the 3 Reconstruction Amendments added to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment permanently outlawed slavery. The 14th guaranteed equal citizenship and protection under the law for all persons born in the U.S., including formerly enslaved people. And the 15th Amendment prohibited denying voting rights based on race. These 3 documents were born directly from the fire of the Civil War, and they fundamentally reshaped the legal and social landscape of modern America. But, memory is a powerful and sometimes easily manipulated thing. After the war, a pseudo-historical myth known as the Lost Cause emerged. As historians note, this ideology attempted to rationalize the Confederate defeat by falsely claiming their cause was just and heroic, while deliberately denying the central role of slavery in causing the war. This right here is exactly why objective history, relying on the primary source documents we looked at earlier, and the preservation of actual physical battlefields remain incredibly vital today. We have to confront history accurately. Now, what's really interesting about this final slide is this. The guns may have fallen silent in 1865, but the big question remains. How does the shadow of a 160-year-old conflict still shape our definitions of liberty, democracy, and equality today? The American Civil War wasn't just some event locked in the past. It was a crucible that continues to define the ongoing American experiment. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history around you.